Next one, we're going to look at military families and the reintegration of military families back into their families from deployment. And what's interesting about this is the high rates of PTSD and the high rates of suicide coming back into society. We look at this on a continuum, if you will. It ranges from severity of combat and operational stress reactions to adjustment disorders, all the way to acute stress disorder, all the way to PTSD. And on this continuum of different types of disorders, you see military soldiers coming back into their community. One of the other factors that's really important is to make sure that we assess for secondary trauma, that we're not, or vicarious trauma, where soldiers are not traumatizing those that they live with based upon coming back into society and bringing the issues back with them into their families. As we look at ministering to the family, we want to make sure that we help them on this continuum of care. And basically a lot of the strategies that we find that work with military soldiers and coming back into reintegrating into society, there are a lot of similar and same effective treatments that we talked about in the past that work. There's different types of cognitive behavioral therapies that work for trauma and for PTSD and others that are really found to be effective. And so it's not the technique per se as much as it is understanding the military family and understanding the military culture and being well versed in it. It's a wide open field, it's a growing field, and it's a great way to really serve our country and serve our soldiers by helping them reintegrate into society. The fourth one is the growing multi-ethnic population that we have in our culture. By 2050, research shows that whites will be a minority. There will be less whites in America than all other ethnic and race groups. And so we are dealing with an ever-growing assimilation of other cultures and races into our nation. And so we want to make sure that we have the competency available to us to work with these different types of ethnic backgrounds and cultures and groups. And that we look at their backgrounds and their worldviews. And we've talked about this in the last session. So as we look at this, it's interesting, I put this up here. By the time boomers retire, the majority on Social Security will be ethnic minorities. In addition, counseling termination rates for whites are 30%, but counseling termination rates for African, Asian, Hispanic, and Native Americans are 50% and higher. Therefore, it's important that we have competently trained cross-cultural counselors because they show less premature termination with different races and ethnic groups than those who are not as culturally competent. It's a growing need to be culturally competent in the 21st century. As we advocate on behalf of multicultural competency in these areas, we need to have cultural specific knowledge. What is it specifically about that particular culture that you need to know? I have been in Rwanda a few times and working with post-genocide victims, and I have studied and I have read books and I have really poured into even interviewing those in the Rwandan culture to understand that culture in a very different light so I can understand it in terms of helping those individuals in the Rwandan culture. If you're working and you have a culture that's very specific to you in the area that you live in, it might be worth reading books and getting information and interviewing those in that particular group to be well versed and trained in that group as you see them coming in. Another one is being scientifically minded. What treatment programs and what techniques work for that particular group of people? I think what's also important here as we look at this is understanding Acts chapter 13 and being the example to follow. The church at Antioch, there were prophets and teachers, it says in Acts chapter 13, Barnabas, Simeon, Lucius of Cyrene, Manaen, and Saul. So after they fasted and prayed, they placed their hands on Barnabas and Saul and sent them off. The early church gathered men who represented different churches and varied skills to work for the common good of evangelism. We need to bring together a team of individuals who are competent, culturally competent from various different ethnic and race backgrounds to be able to have an incredible team of people to rely on to make sure we can bring the best care to those that we minister to. One of these last ones I think is very important, number 6, are disasters and having a cross-cultural approach to disasters. Crisis intervention is not counseling, and I think that's one of the biggest things that I want to point out in this video, and we'll have a specific video later on crisis intervention in the community. But for this particular one, our America is riddled with different natural disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, you name it, to terrorist and man-made disasters. And so we are growing more and more in understanding what it means to help in terms of crisis intervention so that we can mitigate PTSD. And so if you look at crisis intervention, it's not evangelism, it's not outreach, it's not psychotherapy, nor is it a substitute for psychotherapy. It is an active, short-term, supportive, helping process to mitigate PTSD. And as we set up crisis counseling teams in our communities, it's ever more important to make sure that we're surrounding ourselves with those teams so that when crisis hits, we know who to call on in those moments. We'll discuss this more later in another presentation. Finally, the last thing I want to talk about is the role of technology and social media and the impact on today's relationships. And how we in the e-counseling world, ecounseling.com, for instance, is a great example of a website where they're providing care via the internet, where they're providing care via text and video and chat-based platforms and the ethics and issues that come into that. But we are global now. We don't have to. I can see a client through an e-counseling platform on the other side of the world if need be. That's the benefit of e-counseling and the technology that are out there. Again, another influence and factor to look at as we approach counseling our clients in the 21st century. Another factor in that is looking at the role that social media and technology plays on our clients as we see new different issues coming up, such as Facebook depression. We have divorce. 1 in 5 people now cite Facebook as a reason for their divorce. And so we look at technology and social media on our clients and technology and social media on the ethics and the way that we carry out our counseling services. As we finish with the last issue and influence in 21st century, we're looking at the challenges of tomorrow. And that includes managed behavioral health, the merging of clinical care and finances. More than ever, we have to have a business acumen with what we do in our private practices in order to make them continue to thrive and for us to have a living. And so we want to make sure that we see how we are educated in both business and clinical practice. It's very important in the 21st century. There's also a rise of evidence-based practice. We need to make sure that we are using the best practices available based upon the evidence of what works and what doesn't. The next one is managed care. Managed care is now changing the landscape because it is setting rules and regulations on the types of techniques and practices we can and cannot use, and how much money will be paid based upon the client and what the services we're allowed to render to them. And so this is an issue that is coming up here in the 21st century. There's also a challenge to deliver good care while navigating, and I've just kind of mentioned this, while navigating the external laws, regulations, and requirements governing behavioral health care. There's also the factor that we have to spend time on organizational risk management, ensuring that our accreditation, fraud and abuse, antitrust, local, state, federal, contracts, human resources, HIPAA, and other laws and requirements are met. We have all this paperwork. Yet, we have to also, in the midst of navigating all of that, make sure that we put the organizational principles and purposes first, that we allow those things to guide us in our helping practice and our helping procedures. Final thing is navigating Medicaid and state funding. Because most of the time we're getting grants, most of the time we're dealing with individuals who are on Medicaid or we're getting state funding, and they're allowing our programs to persist. So the final slide here, if we look at this, says community mental health services are in a constant state of flux and peril. And we see this with regulations, and we see this with managed care, we see this with the growing need to have a business acumen in what we do. As we close this session, it's important to see all of these issues in the 21st century, how we view them as Christians, how we view them as multiculturally competent counselors, and how we view them in the context of making sure that we navigate each one. And we will get more into detail on some of these throughout this course. But for now, make sure that you become a student of each issue.